American Indian heritages, utilizing local flora and fauna for face paint, and no one ever depicts the ancient Israelites as having done so, but they most certainly did. She grew up in the working class, and she's most likely from the tribe of Judah, Solomon's own tribe. If you're a white person, leprosy doesn't turn your skin whiter. It turns your skin red and makes it look raw. Ayob not zir.
Wake up out of your sleep.
Have you ever heard how black Hebrew Israelites try to prove Jesus was black? To be honest, they all do a horrible job. They're too busy searching for proof that Jesus was black rather than using any of the myriad texts that undoubtedly prove the Yatzer-Elim were black. They allow the ancient phenotype to be more debatable than it really is, and we're going to fix that today. But also, when we fix it, you'll notice that they weren't just dark brown like the majority of Africans. Rather, you'll see that they describe themselves the same way Europeans described American Indians. Watch this. We're going to start with the skin color thing. All the debates usually focus on vague texts from Daniel or Revelation. Our mission is to leave no doubt as to what the phenotypic traits of the Yatzer-Elim were, so we're going to start in Lamentations chapter 5. Verse 10 reads, quote, "Our skin was black like an oven because of the terrible famine," end quote. Okay, I say the following as a trained linguist. The Hebrew word being translated as black here is kamar, which literally means nothing other than the black color that comes from burning something. I'm giving you the D notation complete with its etymological implicature. In other words, I'm providing the literal definition along with the implied reason why this word means what it even means. There are also no alternative interpretations either, because the subsequent prepositional phrase says, like an oven. An oven burns things, so it's often a dull black color, because fire removes most colors from most things that it burns. So that phrase semantically pigeonholes us into rendering this translation exactly as it appears in the King James Version, black. It can only be in reference to the color. Now here's the thing. The sentence also tells us why their skin is black. It's because of the famine. Someone might use this point to argue that their skin wasn't supposed to be black, but that this was a hyperbolic way of describing the effects of malnourishment on the complexion of the people. That argument would actually backfire pretty hard. How so? No matter what your complexion is, the healthier you are, the redder it will be. Red pigmentation is a sign of good health. Healthy white people have pinkish or reddish splotches in their skin, right? But if they get malnourished, they get more pale because the redness leaves them. In fact, when they die, they are their most pale, right? Hence the idiom, pale as death, because they're as malnourished as they can possibly be. The inverse is true for dark-skinned peoples. Being very healthy with dark skin will give you a reddish hue. Brown is honestly just a dark shade of orange, and orange is just the combination of red and yellow. A malnourished brown person will lose the redness in that combination yet remain dark, so the rich brown will become a dusky black like the ashy black of an oven. This statement, this verse, only works if it describes dark brown people. Not only does it not work for white people, it doesn't even apply to light brown people. Light brown people wouldn't get darker due to malnourishment either. Only very dark complexion can make this verse logically comprehensible. When it comes to how a famine can be the cause of a complexion, whites get whiter and blacks get blacker, period. And before anyone says I've taken this out of context, feel free to prove it in the comments. This is a literal famine, one of many afflictions in a list of unrelated afflictions being described in the chapter. We're undoubtedly talking about malnourishment causing dark brown people to look literally black. Let's also not breeze by the obvious fact that the brown complexion that favors redness matches every historical description of pre-Columbian American Indians. I'll circle back to this point later. But for now, suffice it to say that the controversy over the term redskin persists to this day, specifically because of the observation of American Indians as having originally been brown people whose brownness leaned more toward red than toward yellow, and was not grayed out to be like an actual black. Next, we're going to reinforce this with the Levitical Law of the Leper. This is about how the shaman would deal with someone who was suspected of having leprosy. For that, we go to Leviticus 13. We'll read verses 2 through 6. Quote, "When a man shall have in the skin of his flesh a rising, a scab, or bright spot, and it be in the skin of his flesh like the plague of leprosy, then he shall be brought unto Aharon the great shaman, or unto one of his sons the shaman. And the shaman shall look on the plague in the skin of the flesh, and when the hair in the plague is turned white, and the plague in sight be deeper than the skin of his flesh, it is a plague of leprosy. And the shaman shall look on him and pronounce him unclean. If the bright spot be white in the skin of his flesh, and in sight be not deeper than the skin and the hair thereof be not turned white, then the shaman shall shut up him that hath the plague 7 days. And the shaman shall look on him the 7th day. And behold, if the plague in his sight be at a stay, and the plague spread not in the skin, then the shaman shall shut him up 7 days more. And the shaman shall look on him again the 7th day, and behold, if the plague be somewhat dark, and the plague spread not in the skin, the shaman shall pronounce him clean. It is but a scab. And he shall wash his clothes and be clean." End quote. Did you catch that last part? The shaman had to declare that you're clean, signifying that you don't have leprosy. He would only do this if the apparent white lesion turned somewhat dark. That's a quote. Somewhat dark. Why would that mean you're clean? Because it's turning back to your original color. The lesion is beginning to match the rest of your body, which is dark. Darkness equals clean and healthy, whereas whiteness would mean you're diseased. Not only that, even though leprosy is known for turning your skin white, that's only if your skin is already dark brown to begin with. If you're a white person, leprosy doesn't turn your skin whiter. It turns your skin red and makes it look raw. Why would a white scab cause the shaman to suspect that you have leprosy? If you were all white people, a white scab wouldn't look anything like leprosy to you because only red rawness would remind you of leprosy. This passage is written from the perspective of dark-skinned people who only know leprosy based on how it affects dark skin. Leprosy turns you white. That's all they know because they're black. Now we have to deal with the Shulamite Bride controversy. If you're unfamiliar with the Shulamite Bride controversy, it's actually a common debate among Judeo-Christian academics. The debate primarily collapses into dismal aporia over what the hell a Shulamite even is because no one knows, despite many famous scholars having provided elaborate guesses. Some say the word Shulamite is a demonym for a Canaanite tribe that left no historical markers of their existence. Eusebius of Caesarea postulated in ancient times that a Shulamite was a Shunammite for no other reason than that the words sound similar, which is nonsense, but European scholars still respect him anyway. Although those same scholars will call us crazy for listening to Curry Mayo when he uses the same logic to assert that the Sumerians and the Cimmerians are allegedly the same people. That's nonsense too, but in general, Curry Mayo obviously gets a lot more right than Eusebius ever did. So you should be able to take courses in Curry Mayan theory in grad school if you ask me. I digress. Who is the Shulamite Bride? She's actually the best-known wife of Big Chief Solomon despite not even being the queen mother. If this were the mother of Rehoboam, her name would have definitely been in the manuscript. Big Chief Solomon had many wives, and while he certainly transgressed the law in marrying them all, I implore you to seek out the wisdom of Solomon from one of our living seers today, Ayob Natzir, who just recently released a video on the subject, which I will link at the end of this video. Please go watch his video once you reach the end of this. The reason I say the Shulamite Bride is the best-known wife of Big Chief Solomon despite being completely unidentified is because she's the entire focal point of Songs of Solomon, which she co-authored. It's a poetic correspondence between Big Chief Solomon and a bride for whom he showed more passion than he showed for almost anyone else he married because he courted her even though he didn't need to do so. He's king. He doesn't need to court any man's daughter. Also, many of his wives were royalty. yet the Shulamite Bride is implied to have been a peasant girl of meager means. You'll see why shortly. Regardless, she's the only one with whom he appears to have had a genuine romance. They wrote songs to each other because the infatuation was mutual. Here's the real reason why scholars want to make the word Shulamite an ethnonym of some kind. The first chapter, verses 5 and 6. Quote, I am black, but comely. O ye daughters of Jerusalem, as the tents of Kedar, as the curtains of Solomon. Look not upon me because I am black, because the sun hath looked upon me. My mother's children were angry with me. They made me the keeper of the vineyards. But mine own vineyard have I not kept. End quote. She's saying that she's exceptionally dark, perhaps darker than many Africans, and when she describes herself as black but comely, that doesn't mean beautiful in spite of darkness. It means beautiful in spite of the fact that her darkness slightly overpowers her redness. The Hebrew word for black here is shachor, which specifically refers to the darkness of the sky at dusk. It's derived directly from the Hebrew verb for seeking something early in the morning, which is shakar. Dawn and dusk both give the same effect, which is where the redness of the sun's rays are the only remaining part of sunlight in the sky as darkness pushes the rest of the colors away. This happens every evening, and then in the morning it reverses through that same phase. She's saying she's so dark that the redness in her complexion is faint. She also adds that the sun is responsible for this darkness, so she's claiming that she's been permanently tanned by the sun due to her siblings making her do all the farm labor every day. See? That's not an aristocratic lifestyle. She grew up in the working class, and she's most likely from the tribe of Judah, Solomon's own tribe. How do we know she's from Judah if even the scholars remain so nonplussed on this? Well, we can extrapolate that from the references she makes. First of all, she makes a direct address to the daughters of Jerusalem as if that's a community who knows her. But of course, this alone could still be something an arrogant foreigner might say upon wedding their king. One might say she has to be from Kedar if she personally knows how black the tents of Kedar are. But that's not true because Kedar was known for being a terrain that appeared from a distance to be carpeted black because of the Ishmaelites' black tents. The proof of that is in the fact that the word Kedar inherently means black, as well as the fact that this reference is expected to be understood by all who hear this being read by the scribes in the court of Big Chief Solomon. It's an ancient Hebrew cliche, not a personal anecdote. This logic is further supported by her doing the same thing in verse 9, using an Egyptian reference this time. Quote, I have compared thee, O my love, to a company of horses in Pharaoh's chariots. End quote. She compares Solomon to the horses that pull Pharaoh's chariots. Is she both an Ishmaelite and an Egyptian simultaneously? No, she's invoking hyperbolic imagery that an ancient Israelite audience would have considered palpable. Pharaoh's train was famously magnificent, that's the point. One didn't have to be from Egypt to get the reference. The final reference, however, is the obscure one. It's the last of three similes with geographic significance, and it comes in verse 14. She says, quote, my beloved is unto me as a cluster of campfire in the vineyards of Ein Gedi, end quote. Ein Gedi is not a famous city. It was the boondocks of Judah on the west bank of the Salt Sea, also called the Dead Sea. It's only ever mentioned 6 times in all of Scripture, and this is arguably the only mention that matters. Camphire is an antiquated term for henna, which is a plant whose flowers ancient Israelites used to use to make perfume, face paint, and dye for clothing. I'd be remiss if not to highlight the fact that nearly all American Indian heritages include a history of utilizing local flora and fauna for face paint and clothing. No one ever depicts the ancient Israelites as having done so, but they most certainly did. The Jewish Encyclopedia has an entry for henna, which says, quote, in ancient times it grew very plentifully near Ein Gedi. Tristram reports having found it growing there. Various uses were made of camphire. Along with other fragrant woods, it was valued for its perfume, but it was utilized chiefly as a dye for the hair and the skin. In dyeing the skin, cloths were placed on the parts adjacent to and encircling those to be dyed. To these parts, the powdered leaves, made into a paste by the addition of a little water, were applied and allowed to remain overnight. The stain lasted for 3 or 4 weeks. End quote. This is an indigenous American practice and an Aboriginal Australian practice, and the plant still reportedly grew there in the day of Henry Baker Tristram, which was the 1800s CE. Henna grew in many places, but how would the Shulamite Bride know it specifically also grew in the vineyards of Ein Gedi if she herself weren't an Israelite? Would an Egyptian have known that? That's like a Japanese woman knowing what kind of grass people grew in their yards specifically in Sandusky, Ohio. Not Miami, Florida, not Los Angeles, California, but Sandusky, Ohio. A lot of Americans haven't even heard of Sandusky, which is my point. Knowing what the vineyards are like in Ein Gedi is very specific, and the speaker already told us she's been living the life of a vine dresser. She's a keeper of vineyards, not a botanist. We have no reason to think she just knows all the vegetation of the region, but she at least knows that henna sprouts in the vineyards of Ein Gedi. That's most likely because she's from the West Bank herself, which means she's a natural-born citizen of the tribe of Judah, Solomon's own tribe.
Hey y'all! First of all, like and subscribe to the channel, but also, Unahia is recruiting, and if you don't know what Unahia is, we're a grassroots activist group lobbying Congress to amend a bill to require education and research to acknowledge the Negro origins of Aboriginal groups of North America. If any of you have it to give, please support the campaign using the QR code on your screen, join the campaign with a donation, and if you have the time, you can even join our staff to help guide the organization, not just for this campaign, but also future endeavors. Don't speak about it, be about it. Let's go.
So what's a Shulamite then? As it so happens, debatably, the most popular theory is actually the correct one, which is that this word was Big Chief Solomon's own pet name for all his wives. He married so many women that he spoke of them as though they were an entire tribe unto themselves. The harem of Shlomo were facetiously called Shulamim by Shlomo himself. The female voice in Song of Solomon is a woman of Judah who describes herself as being extremely dark, comparing herself to the actual color black in an era when the term black had no ethnic significance whatsoever. Finally, I want to look at Esau and David. Esau's complexion is thoroughly misunderstood by black Hebrew Israelites. They always say he was red because he was white with those pinkish splotches that white people tend to have, but then they assume Jacob was, of course, a dark brown man. Now that's far from impossible, but it's unlikely that that's what was being communicated in Scripture. When we look at the way their births are described in the 25th chapter of Bereshith, which is Genesis, verse 25 says, quote, "And the first came out red, all over like an hairy garment, and they called his name Esau," end quote. So we established he's red, but of course we see nothing about whiteness. So stop calling white people Esau. Red and white have nothing to do with each other because in Yatsar Eli culture, a reddish hue in one's complexion was a good thing. To call someone red was a compliment. It meant their brownness was rich. Hence verses 12 and 13 in 1 Samuel 16. This is existence talking to his name power about boils with love. Existence is Yahweh, and his name power is the one we call Shmuel or Samuel. Boils with love is Dawid or David. Talking to his name power about boils with love, existence said, quote, "And he, what already is, whom we call Yishai or Jesse, he sent and brought him, boils with love in." Now boils with love was ruddy, and withal of a beautiful countenance, and goodly to look to. And existence said, "Arise, anoint him, for this is he." Then his name power took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brethren, and the sacred wind of existence came upon boils with love from that day forward. So his name power rose up and went to Ramah. Did you catch that word ruddy? It said David was ruddy, which means red. In Hebrew, it's admoni. When Esau was called red, that was the exact same word, admoni. Both Esau and David are read in the exact same way, and when it's said about David he's not just called red, it's confirmed that this reddish complexion is good for looking at and of a beautiful countenance. In other words, David was quite handsome, and the only defining characteristic of that attractiveness was his redness. Ancient Israelites prided themselves on being red. The most attractive ones were called red. Esau was being lauded by being called red, not derided. The same was the case for calling Indians red people or red men. The earliest mentions of this don't come from European observations of Indians, but from Indians calling themselves red to distinguish themselves from Europeans whom they called white. Yes, I'm saying Indians called themselves red first, and then Europeans started saying it. If that sounds backwards, I'll refer you to a 1997 peer-reviewed journal article by Nancy Shoemaker in the American Historical Review. And from white man to redskin changing Anglo-American perceptions of the American Indian, Alan Vaughan moved toward correcting this misconception, when he instead credited the Swedish naturalist Carolus Linnaeus with making red a racial category in his 1740 edition of Systema Naturae. Skip down to the next paragraph, though. However, giving Linnaeus sole credit perpetuates another misconception. Linnaeus chose red as a category for Indians, but he was not the first person to do so. More than a decade before the 1740 edition of Systema Naturae, American Indians, particularly Indians in the Southeast, were calling themselves red. This article discusses when, how, and why Southeastern Indians introduced the term red people or red men into the language of Indian-European contact. It then explores what red meant to one Southeastern Indian group, the Cherokees, in their initial encounters with English colonists and in their later encounters with Americans. End quote. The 5 civilized tribes were willfully identifying as red as early as the 1720s. Today, Native Americans can't even agree on whether or not it's a pejorative term because no one knows for sure what the origin of it is. It wasn't an insult. It wasn't even necessarily something Europeans came up with. Indians took pride in being red because it was a sign of not just surviving but thriving. Red was attractive to them. They had the same mentality 300 years ago that their ancestors had 3,000 years ago. 1 is an incident. 2 is a coincidence. 3 is a pattern. That's the shamanic Hichiti principle of discernment. When I showed you the use of the phrase black like an oven in Lamentations, you witnessed an incident wherein the children of Yatsar-El were described as black due to losing the redness of brown complexion via malnourishment. When I presented the ancient Levitical Law of the Leper, it posed what could have simply been a coincidence wherein the children of Yatsar-El acknowledged dark complexion yet again as their default color in contrast with the white lesion suspected of being the start of what can only match the description of how leprosy affects very dark brown skin. Whereas white and light brown peoples would not view a white lesion as indicative of leprosy, given that leprosy manifests on them as raw redness. When you witnessed the Shulamite Bride explicitly refer to herself as black, however, you bore witness to the establishment of a pattern. We now have a pattern of Israelites identifying themselves as not just brown, but very dark brown. Not only that, they consistently privilege redness in the pigmentation as both healthy and physically attractive. All of this tracks with the copper-colored peoples of the Americas. It's a different darkness than what's typically seen among Africans. It's very similar, but this redness makes for a slight distinction. This isn't African blackness. It's Asian blackness. And no, Asian blackness did not come from Africa. The entire world was black. We don't need to identify a source continent for the black phenotype. We need only identify a source continent for the white phenotype. Now that we have a clear pattern in Scripture of Israelites identifying their own complexion as dark, let's compare that to how the 1828 Webster's Dictionary originally described American Indians. The entry for the word American simply said, quote, a native of America, originally applied to the Aboriginals or copper-colored races found here by the Europeans, but now applied to the descendants of Europeans born in America. End quote. Copper is to brown what gold is to yellow. It's the same color with a different texture. The founder of the Pennsylvania colony, William Penn, said it differently. In his letter to the Committee of the Free Society of Traders in 1683, he described the Indians as swarthy, which literally means dark-skinned. He was talking about the Lenape on the East Coast, and a 2006 article in local Colorado newspaper Summit Daily confirms that the Ute of Utah and Colorado were, quote, Called the Black Indians by other tribes, they were surprisingly dark-skinned, end quote. Again, 1 is an incident, 2's a coincidence, 3 is a pattern. An example from the East Coast, another example from the Southwest, and the dictionary definition of what an American even is. The red man was black. That's why Native American historian Jack D. Forbes chose to use the term Red Black Peoples in the title of his book. We are Black Indian Hebrew Israelites, an ethnic group chosen by the elements to fix the world.
Well, in the early 1500s, they started bringing in a few African slaves, but they had some second thoughts. They were also very worried because some of the Africans, particularly from Senegal, were Muslims. And they didn't want Islam, they didn't want Judaism either, but they didn't want any foreign religion but Christianity spreading in the Americas.